Before I get into things, I'd like to thank everyone who watched my review of Odyssey. It's now my most viewed video. Its success made sure that I would be reviewing Valhalla, which I still plan on doing, but it's a very long game, and I would like to make a much more in-depth review this time. I'd also like to mention that while this video is a criticism of Valhalla, I still think it's well made and lots of fun. I enjoyed Origins, Odyssey, and I enjoy Valhalla even more. That being said, Assassin's Creed Valhalla has a loot problem. For the majority of the series, players have been able to equip different weapons with varying levels of quality. Whether you're unlocking it, buying it, or looting it from dead enemies, that element has always existed. With the jump to Origins, Ubisoft opted for a more traditional loot system akin to Diablo or Destiny. You know, blues, purple, orange, that sort of thing. It also leaned more towards outright hack and slash combat, rewarding stealth as opposed to requiring it. Origins was a polarizing game, but Odyssey was really where some fans of the series had enough. The loot and damage sponge enemies got a bit out of control. So for Valhalla, the devs once again drastically changed how loot works, striking a balance between the old and new style. Think of it like the legendary weapons in Odyssey, where they're found in specific spots on the map and without any random weapons dropping from enemies. The problem with this is twofold: the rarity of loot and the existence of microtransactions. Let's start with loot rarity. Unlike the last two games, loot rarity in this case doesn't refer to its quality. Loot in Valhalla is literally rare. You will go hours and hours without finding a new weapon, and it's possible you will use the same armor for a majority of the game. I'm currently 25 hours in, and I'm still using the starting axe. I have a decent selection of weapons, but for each weapon type, I only have a couple. If I wasn't seeking them out, I would only have one of each type. The bummer on top of that is the difference between my two greatswords is mostly how they look and their passive trait. This one is slightly faster, while this one does slightly more crit damage. So when I found this new greatsword after using the same one for about 5 hours, I was excited and quickly disappointed. Oh, there's flails in the game? Well, I only have one. If I hadn't looked online for more loot, I would have one dagger. If I didn't have Twitch Prime, I would have just 2 full armor sets. Now, if you're looking for hard numbers on how many weapons or armor sets are in the game, I don't have exact figures because of how incomplete most guides are right now, but according to IGN, there are around 24 primary weapons, 9 bows, and 11 shields. Those primary weapons are made up of 7 types of each weapon, so yeah, 24 divided by 7, do the math. Some categories only have like 2 or 3 weapons. Don't get too excited for flails because there's only a couple in the entire game. For many of you, this is great news, and initially I liked this new approach. If the mountain of blue and purple gear put you off from the previous games, Valhalla is here for you. If you find a sword or bow that you like, you don't have to worry about it suddenly becoming underleveled. It's no longer a constant treadmill of leveling, looting, crafting, and grinding. But the problem is that they divided Odyssey's loot pool by 5, removed rarity, and just called it a day. Finding new weapons in Origins and Odyssey broke up the monotony of the fairly simple combat, but Valhalla makes no changes in that regard. Like Odyssey was to Origins, Valhalla feels rearranged rather than revolutionary. For example, to my knowledge, all of the weapons have the same animations. Every greatsword has the same light attack, and every bearded axe has the same heavy attack. Compare this to Dark Souls 3, a game with more unique weapons, which also have different attacks and abilities. You might have 2 greatswords, but they handle completely differently. I may only have 1 flail in Valhalla, but I can guarantee the next one I find will handle almost identically. Instead of every greatsword having this charge attack ability, What if one allowed you to block and another allowed you to do a spinning attack? What if instead of a flurry of attacks, you could throw your dagger at an enemy? Imagine finding a spear that had really low damage, but stunned the hell out of enemies, more like a staff. Basically what I'm saying is, making each weapon viable was a great opportunity to make them unique. Even the random loot generation of Borderlands results in completely different feeling weapons, bringing a lot of fun and variety to an otherwise basic shooter. In some ways, I like it more than the grind of Origins and Odyssey, but in other ways, I miss the thrill of randomly finding a cool new sword. Oh yeah, and the cherry on top is that there's no more transmog system. Awesome. The lack of loot is a problem, but there's another system that makes the loot pool even shallower. As you progress, you place points in this sprawling web of stats and skills. Naturally, you're presented with 3 paths, roughly associated with ranged, melee, and stealth buffs. Within these paths, you'll find either bear, wolf, or raven gear buffs, and each piece of gear is aligned with one of those animals. So going deep into the bear path means you have tons of buffs to bear aligned gear. This means if you're trying to spec optimally, finding a raven or wolf aligned weapon is useless. Being spec'd into the bear path myself and having the choice between a raven greatsword or a bear greatsword, which do you think I'm going to pick? Is it even a choice? Broadening the scope to my full arsenal, there are entire sets of armor that I just shouldn't use. None of my spears or light shields are bear aligned, so if I'm trying to do the most damage possible, it would be foolish to use them. Neither Origins nor Odyssey used a system like this. Obviously, there were better choices based on how you spec'd and geared your character, but this part of the system obviously wasn't thought out. When there are a handful of axes and only 2 are aligned with your animal path, then there are functionally only 2 axes. If you follow the wolf path and one of your 2 armor sets are wolf aligned, then you really only have 1 viable armor set. This animal system serves as a filter that goes through the already shallow loot pool and leaves you with very few options. The goal of these types of systems is to provide depth and increase the player's investment in their RPG choices. After all, playing Dark Souls optimally means you go full dex or strength. In order to use some weapons, you must give up the ability to wield others. The difference there, and in many other RPGs, is that the gameplay is significantly different because of those choices. Your playstyle in Valhalla may vary, but it's not a game like Dark Souls where you would replay the game and have a wildly different experience. The weird part is that you can respec anytime for free. So does anything really matter? Was there a point in making it like this, or did they just see Path of Exile and think it looked cool? In the moment, it's fine. None of this ruins the game, but if you think about it too hard, it doesn't make much sense. It takes an already meh loot system and messes it up even more. So far, my complaints may not be resonating with you. These might be overwhelmingly positive changes, and you may have 0 problems with them. Well, now it's time for an undeniable problem exacerbated by the lack of loot: the microtransactions. Currently, there are several otherworldly and outlandish outfits, weapons, and mounts to be had for real money in the store. Yes, you can technically earn these through Retta and the Opal black market, but come on. Ubisoft basically did that in order to give fanboys that asterisk of, well, actually, you can earn them by playing the game, blah blah blah. No, they want to make money, and most people aren't going to do dailies and wait for specific armor to rotate into the shop. They're just gonna buy that cool set of Valkyrie armor. This wasn't that big of a deal to me in Origins or Odyssey because you're absolutely showered with loot, and much of it was mythical and wild. Why would I pay for a set of armor if I'm constantly finding new sets, and when I have this fantastic transmog system? I think you can see where this is going. Currently, there is more gear in the shop than I have in my inventory. And this is just what the game launched with. As they continue to add more sets, I doubt I'll ever have as much game-gotten gear as there is in the store, which really bothers me. A lot of players were rightfully upset over the XP and money boosters in Odyssey, but I argue this is almost as bad. In the end, those boosters aren't adding anything new. They're speeding up your progress and improving the pacing, but nothing of substance is added. Or rather, you don't feel like they're selling back to you something that should have been in the game. But something like the Berserker set is ripped right out of the game and sold back to the player in the form of Ultimate Editions or microtransactions. Despite what people say, cosmetics do affect gameplay. If they didn't, nobody would have complained about the Avengers loot not changing how the characters looked. If cosmetics didn't affect gameplay, companies wouldn't be making millions selling skins. For most of us, we want our character to look like a badass, so even in single-player games, these things are sometimes tempting. The issue is that these aren't just cosmetic. Ubisoft isn't selling skins, they're selling functionally different items in a game with a much smaller loot pool than previous games. The game launched with 4 purchasable sets, with a 5th arriving before they released a much needed patch. That might not sound like much, but in a couple of months that number could double, while the in-game loot stays the same. I also noticed a disturbing marketing move made with Twitch Prime. The Carolingian set, acquired by having Twitch Prime, includes an armor set, ship set, spear, and shield, but it didn't include a sword I found in the world called the Carolingian Longsword. So clearly, the game once contained the Carolingian items found in the promotional pack until Amazon approached Ubisoft with a fat check. They just couldn't take out the sword because there's only like 3 in the entire game. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is greater than the sum of its parts. The AAA publisher greed is on full display here, and for the first time, I can plainly see how much content was carved out of a game. Changes were made that don't serve any purpose other than making change, and very little attention was paid to balance. But is Valhalla still a good game? Absolutely. I'll eventually have a full review explaining why, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, just don't buy any microtransactions.